Welcome to today's webinar from the USD Prescribing Research Network. This webinar is sponsored by the USD Prescribing Research Network, who is funded by the National Institute on Aging. My name is Dr. Jennifer Chia. I'm co-lead of the Investigator Development Corps with Ken Bookbar in New York. And before we get going with our presentation by Dr. Marcum, I just want to cover a few technical details. Due to the number of registrants for today's webinar, we've placed all of the phone lines on mute to reduce feedback. So unless you're logged in as a host or panelist, your line is muted. However, we welcome and encourage audience participation using the Q&A feature. And we'll ask you to do that and submit your questions throughout the seminar, and we'll cover them at the end. When you would like to interact with the presenter, please click on the Q&A bubble at the bottom of the toolbar and type your question in the box. And if you would like your question to be anonymous, you can check the anonymous box before sending. The host will acknowledge the questions at the end, as I mentioned. If you have any technical issues or logistical questions, we ask that you submit those in the chat box and select the co-host, Jonathan Norton, and chat privately. Please make sure that you identify yourself either by name or your participant ID so that our webinar host will be able to troubleshoot. We'd like to extend a huge thanks finally to the people without whom this would not be possible, Gabby Scheller at Mount Sinai, Geraldine Puerto and Vanessa Duodo at UMass Medical School, and Jonathan Norton at Johns Hopkins, and Milena Spar and Anil Rizzo at UCSF. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Zach Marcum, PhD, PharmD, and MS. Dr. Marcum is assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacy at the University of Washington. He's also director of research for the Plein Center for Geriatric Pharmacy Research, Education, and Outreach. He's an investigator on federally funded research grants and is author of more than 80 peer-reviewed publications. He's received an American Geriatric Society New Investigator Award and has previously completed a 2-year fellowship in geriatric pharmacotherapy research at the University of Pittsburgh. He's going to speak to us today about pharmaceutical use in brain health. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to you. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Marcum.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you to the USD Prescribing Network for the invitation to present at this month's webinar. So as the title suggests, I'll be presenting today on the topic of pharmaceutical use in brain health. And I intentionally chose the broad term pharmaceutical use since I'll be discussing both prescription drugs as well as herbal supplements. And when I say brain health, I'm primarily referring to dementia. So let's get started. I have no conflicts to disclose. And to get us started, I'll be using poll everywhere today for just a couple questions to have some crowd participation. So Jonathan is going to enter a link in the chat box for this website, pollev.com/Marcum. So go ahead and click on that in any browser. You can leave it open during the talk. We'll come back to it a couple times. And just as a heads up, it'll ask you to enter your name on the first screen. So once you get through that process, go ahead and respond to this question here. I'm curious where people are calling in from. We've got a lot of folks in the East Coast, Midwest, the South in the US, some European representation. Oh, am I alone here? Oh, there we go. We've got some West Coasters. Great. It's a pretty broad representation geographically today. That's great. And that's one of the silver linings, I think, of this Zoom era is we can have greater access to different webinars and things. So as a brief overview, we'll start off with a quick review of the extent of medication and supplement use among older adults in the US. And then I'll focus on just a few representative prescription and OTC medications and their associations with dementia. And then we'll discuss herbal supplements and vitamins and the evidence base for their use as it relates to dementia. And it's really this last section that the subtitle came from, about magical thinking. And I think you'll get what I mean by that by the end of this presentation. I also wanted to point out that I will not be covering a comprehensive list of all meds and supplements as they relate to dementia risk. So to start, this is not news to anyone in our audience, but it's helpful to orient to the issue using nationally representative data. And in this paper in 2016, Cato and colleagues reported that the use of prescription medications and supplements in older adults is high and increasing over time. So these data come from the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, which is a nationally representative in-home survey that uses kind of a gold standard approach of direct medication visualization to collect the med data. And they compared their figures between 2011 and some of their prior work in 2005, given the significant changes that had occurred over this period, such as Medicare Part D in 2006, new drugs being approved, and more generic medications becoming available. So this figure here shows the prevalence of medication use and supplement use, comparing 0506 versus 10 and 11 overall, which is this first panel, and by the number and type of medication. So you can see here their composite measure, whether it's defined as 1 or more, 2 or more, or 5 or more, medication use and supplement use has increased over time. For prescription medications, you also see the prevalence increasing from about 84% to about 88%. Polypharmacy, defined as 5+ meds, increased from about 31% to 36%. And for dietary supplements, these also increased from approximately 52% to 64%. In the context of dementia prevention, pharmaceutical use can be thought of, I think, in one of two strategies. One, you could avoid harmful meds or supplements, which is simply risk avoidance. Or two, if there's evidence to support this, you could take a medication or supplement for a product that shows improvements in brain health. But unfortunately, in dementia, we currently do not have any approved drugs that are disease modifying for the treatment of dementia. So a lot of the focus is currently on prevention. And this figure shows in the red line the typical Alzheimer's disease progression, declining from normal cognition through MCI and into dementia. And in the orange at the bottom, we see a hypothetical treatment that would be started once someone is already demented, and it's really not accomplishing much in terms of changing the clinical picture. So ideally, we would implement preventative strategies that direct a patient's cognitive trajectory along the blue line. And again, that could be either avoiding harmful drugs, deprescribing anticholinergics, for example, or taking beneficial treatments if and when they are available. So now let's talk about a couple representative medications as they relate to dementia risk. You're probably familiar with this study. It was a seminal article published in 2015 on the association between cumulative use of strong anticholinergic drugs and incident dementia in the ACT study here in Seattle, led by Shelley Gray. And in the ACT study, participants are dementia-free at baseline, and then they're followed up every 2 years. They use computerized pharmacy fill data to calculate a cumulative anticholinergic use, and they used a standardized daily dose approach, looking over a 10-year period of time. The outcomes of dementia and Alzheimer's disease were measured using standard diagnostic criteria. They found that the most common subclasses used were TCAs, first-generation antihistamines, and bladder antimuscarinics. And the punchline here, their main result, is that they found that cumulative anticholinergic use was associated with a significantly increased risk of dementia. As a point of reference, this TSDD value represents daily use of a strong anticholinergic drug for more than 3 years. So for example, olanzapine 2.5 milligrams for at least 3 years. And then a few years later, the study from the UK used their clinical practice research data link, and they did a case control study selecting patients with a diagnosis of dementia and compared their prescription of anticholinergic drugs before a diagnosis of dementia with that of a matched group of control patients without dementia. And consistent with the prior study that we just talked about, these investigators found that anticholinergic use was associated with increased odds of dementia. And importantly, given their data set, they were able to look back quite far in time prior to the dementia diagnosis to look at exposure. So now that we have robust observational data suggesting an increased risk, clinical trials are ongoing to see if deprescribing anticholinergics can improve brain health. And this is just one example of one of those. The R2D2 study, which will be testing whether the adverse cognitive effects of anticholinergic drugs are reversible using a pharmacist-based deprescribing intervention. And this is taking place in the primary care setting. So the target population is older adults in primary care who have a subjective cognitive decline or who make at least one error in a cognitive screening test, but are dementia-free and also currently taking a strong anticholinergic drug. So the intervention and outcome measurement period will take place over 24 months. So it'll really be able to evaluate the long-term impact of this intervention. Primary outcome is cognition, and they'll of course be looking at safety outcomes as well. I'm aware of at least one other ongoing trial deprescribing anticholinergics in older adults, and I'm sure that there are several others that I'm not aware of. So what do patients believe about anticholinergics in brain health? These are data from a survey that we did among a convenience sample of Kaiser Permanente Washington members. You can see their demographic characteristics listed there. And what did we find? We found that 1 out of 3 respondents reported that OTC sleep aids, such as Benadryl, were very or somewhat harmful to brain health. So, some people were aware of this evidence, but the vast majority, 2 out of 3 respondents reported not knowing, indicating that there's a lot of opportunity here for education and outreach. So now let's hop back over to Poll Everywhere. And for those of you who are providing clinical care, you can think about this in terms of your patients and their caregivers. If you're not providing clinical care, you could think about it in terms of your family members or members of the lay public. How aware do you think people are of the potential risks of these meds as they relate to brain health? Okay, so it looks like we've got a distribution toward the not very aware, which is consistent with our survey results. I think in our circles of deprescribing and medication safety in older adults, we hear this so many times that it just seems quite obvious. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a disconnect, and patients aren't routinely thinking about deprescribing and anticholinergic risks. So although it may seem common knowledge to us, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done for consistent education along those lines. So just some quick take-home points. Our goal is to minimize exposure to anticholinergic medications to the greatest extent possible. Among those patients who are receiving them, I think it's important to routinely consider dose reduction and discontinuation when appropriate. It's an exciting time in the field of deprescribing, in particular, deprescribing anticholinergics. So stay tuned for trial data. And again, just to point out, I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to need consistent patient and caregiver education on this topic. Another medication class that was examined for possible association with dementia was PPIs. So it initially was reported in 2013 that lansoprazole increased amyloid beta production in some cellular models and an animal model of AD, but the exact mechanism was never really fully understood. So you had some initial pharmacoepi studies that came out that reported an association between PPI use and increased risk of dementia, but these studies had some limitations. And so really, this is kind of the classic conundrum in pharmacoepi. The central question is whether these observed positive associations were due to the effects of the PPI drug or factors leading to it being prescribed. So people in worse health that could also increase the risk of dementia. So again, Shelley Gray and colleagues conducted analyses in the ACT study showing that PPI use, whether measured by cumulative dose or duration, was not associated with the risk of dementia. And this finding has been replicated in other samples as well. So although there are other safety concerns with long-term PPI use, the results from this study do not support that these medications should be avoided out of a concern of dementia risk. But we have plenty of other reasons to not use PPIs willy-nilly. So going back to our survey, what do patients believe about this? So we found that about 20% of respondents said that PPIs were very or somewhat harmful to brain health. So again, there was a lot of media coverage of these initial studies. I, for one, know my mom asked me about it as soon as it came out. She was concerned. So that, there is some misunderstandings that remain. And the vast majority of people reported not knowing. So again, just underscoring the importance of consistent and clear education for our patients. Just to remind everybody that for PPIs, no one with proper indications should be deprived due to concerns for dementia risk. In those with appropriate indications, we should strive for the lowest effective dose. And our goal should be to avoid unnecessary long-term or continuous therapy. And thankfully, we're equipped with some really quality deprescribing algorithms for PPIs from groups like Caden. So I think we're well equipped to tackle this problem at the moment. So now that we've covered two medication classes in the context of potential risk, I thought we could take an optimistic detour briefly into the world of potential benefit from certain drugs. We don't typically think of drug benefits when thinking about deprescribing, but it's important to keep in mind that not all drugs are meant to be deprescribed. So in the world of dementia, one of the most studied and exciting areas is with antihypertensives and possibly reducing risk of dementia. As a brief background, we know from decades of research that long-term control of cardiovascular risk factors may reduce dementia risk. One of the most common cardiovascular risk factors is hypertension, which affects the majority of older adults. But our current hypertension guidelines are not informed by effects of these drugs on brain outcomes, but rather on cardiovascular outcomes and mortality. A little bit more background. We know that delaying dementia onset for even a small percentage of people would reduce the overall burden. So it doesn't take much benefit to make a significant public health impact. But the current evidence in this space is limited in that people have used a variety of different study designs, comparison groups, as well as variation in their ability to control for confounding like blood pressure. We also know that antihypertensives are comprised of numerous subclasses. They all reduce blood pressure, but they do it by different mechanisms. And so one kind of unifying hypothesis is the role of angiotensin. And this is the hypothesis that our group has been testing and is continuing to test. And it essentially groups the major antihypertensive subclasses into one of two categories. Those on the left that stimulate angiotensin 2 at certain receptors, most notably AT2 and AT4, and those on the right that inhibit the activity of angiotensin 2 at certain receptors, whether directly or indirectly. And it's important to know that the question here is, what is the independent effect of these drugs, separate from their blood pressure lowering effect? So we initially tested this hypothesis by teaming up with our colleagues in the Netherlands who worked on the PREDIVA trial. So we conducted a post-hoc longitudinal cohort study using data from the PREDIVA trial, which was conducted in Dutch general practices. And they enrolled community dwelling older adults 70 to 78. And the trial aside, what we did was we tested this hypothesis in this cohort of individuals. And we found that angiotensin 2 stimulating antihypertensive use was associated with a lower dementia risk compared to angiotensin 2 inhibiting use after controlling for a variety of different potential confounders and the competing risk of mortality. And this paper is now online if you're interested in reading it. So again, coming back to what do patients think about this idea? Now we're far from this being an actual strategy in clinical practice, but I do think it's useful to kind of be aware of what patients are thinking in the event that it could become a treatment strategy. And so in this survey item, we posed this hypothetical situation that there is this antihypertensive medication that was shown to prevent or delay dementia. Would you be interested in taking it? And the vast majority of people currently taking an antihypertensive, not too surprisingly, said that they would be interested in starting as early as midlife, because that seems to be kind of the sweet spot in terms of having the biggest bang for your buck for dementia risk reduction. So people are generally open to this idea, at least those who are currently taking an antihypertensive. So taking a big step back, why is this research important? Well, antihypertensives are some of the most commonly used chronic medications. Also in dementia treatment right now, we currently have no disease modifying treatments. So a lot of the focus is on prevention. And again, reducing the risk of dementia, even a small amount on a population level, can have tremendous impact. And this has been highlighted in a couple landmark reports for dementia. For example, the National Academy of Medicine report in 2017, where they compiled a list of priority research questions. So they're calling for research comparing different classes in context of their risk on dementia. And most recently in 2020, this updated version of the Lancet Commission's report on dementia prevention, intervention, and care, they have been recommending controlling blood pressure in midlife, but this time they add that antihypertensive treatment for hypertension is the only known effective preventive medication for dementia. However, like I mentioned before, we're not quite at the point where we're ready to recommend specific antihypertensive drugs. So hopefully in my lifetime that becomes one of the treatment strategies to reduce risk, but we'll see. There's still a lot of research left to be done. And just to wrap up this segment with a very useful paper that was published this year, Funnell and colleagues conducted this scoping review to identify drug classes associated with either increasing or decreasing risk of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So they ended up finding 29 different drug classes across 404 unique papers, and they provided supporting information where they discuss in detail these results. And they also discuss the hypothesized mechanism of action on ADRD for each drug class. And importantly, if anyone is interested in this field, they provide a public tool for you to use to customize searches and bibliographies of the studies to support future research. So this would be an excellent and up-to-date for the time being resource to get started if you're interested in any sort of drug ADRD risk question. Okay, so now let's shift gears and get into the much less regulated world of supplements and vitamins. And again, this is where a lot of the magical thinking comes into play. So picture this. If you're like me, you've been sitting here in the evening watching TV and a commercial pops on for Prevagen. Sometimes it pops on more than once in a given segment. And they use language such as, in clinical trials, it's been shown to improve short-term memory. It's a breakthrough product. And the secret ingredient was originally discovered in jellyfish. I mean, how cool is that? Sounds like something I'd want to take. And there are newer products as well. For example, this one, Neriva, which, as far as I understand, is mostly just caffeine. So this is very much kind of a direct-to-consumer marketing that's taking place in households across America every night. And so I'm curious, this is our last poll everywhere question, but have you had patients or caregivers or your own family members ask about these products? And how do you respond? Someone says, no, they have not had patients ask yet. There aren't good studies to show they work. It's certainly true. Yes, I tell them not to buy any of them. Great advice. Yes. No, they've asked about ginkgo. Okay. No. Discourage use. products have no effect at all. See, there's no data. Great. Different brands in the UK, but yes, I'm mostly concerned about interactions, usually discourage use. Excellent. Not FDA approved. That's a great one. Exactly, and we're going to get to that point that you just made, so thanks for bringing that up. All right, so yeah, thank you all for sharing those experiences. So this is just a Google search term trend of the word Prevagen, which is the brand name of the product in the US, and simply showing that people are increasingly searching for this, which is not too surprising given the marketing. And it's also important to keep in mind with these products that consumers, patients, caregivers are navigating through the internet. And the internet is wonderful for many reasons, but it's also, it can be quite confusing if you don't know what you're looking for or looking at. So for example, this website looks pretty legitimate, right? The Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation. And then you look at some of the language and it's simply inconsistent with the evidence. So it says, if you're serious about the prevention of Alzheimer's and improving memory loss, you should definitely take a high potency multivitamin and mineral capsule. But be sure the vitamin formula you choose contains folic acid and vitamin C. And then they go on, vitamin C has been shown to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease when taken with vitamin E. So anyways, you get the point. By the end of reading this, you think that you need to be on 7 different drugs. And you also think that by taking those, you're going to truly reduce your risk of Alzheimer's. So this is what we're working against here in communicating with patients. This was a systematic review in 2018 that was conducted, and the results from this review went into that National Academies report that I previously mentioned. So in this systematic review, they included 38 trials that had low to medium risk of bias, and they looked at a variety of different treatment strategies, including omega-3 fatty acids, soy, ginkgo biloba, B vitamins, vitamin D plus calcium, vitamin C, multivitamin, etc. And the take-home point here is quite simple. It's that evidence is insufficient to recommend any OTC supplement for cognitive protection in adults with normal cognition or MCI. This is a really, really helpful report if you're interested in this space and want to read more and learn more, from the Global Council on Brain Health, which is an independent collaborative of scientists and health professionals and policy experts from around the world who are all thinking about brain health. And it's convened by AARP with support from Age UK. And so they met in Washington, DC a few years ago to address this topic. And as a result, they released this report. So let's start with a definition of what is a dietary supplement. So these are products taken by mouth that contain a dietary ingredient, such as vitamins, minerals, amino acids, botanicals, and enzymes. They come in every dosage form you could imagine. And just as a little thought quiz, think to yourself, how many dietary supplement products do you think are sold in the US? These are data as of 2018. Do you think it's 200, 2,000, 20,000? It's actually 85,000. So this is a very, very crowded market with a lot of options. And not surprisingly, the reason why there are so many options is because there's money to be made. The retail sales in the US is greater than $40 billion. As somebody mentioned in one of the comments, manufacturers are generally prohibited from selling unsafe ingredients, but none of them regulate or evaluate dietary supplements for effectiveness before they're permitted to be sold. And here in the US, the FDA does not determine whether dietary supplements are both safe and effective. And in fact, the FDA's role in this space is quite reactionary in that they can pull something from the market if there's a serious safety concern, but there's not really that preemptive assessment like they do for prescription drugs. So in conjunction with this report, they also conducted an AARP survey. So among adults aged 50 and older, the vast majority believe that supplements are at least somewhat important for overall health. Nearly 3 out of 4 are currently taking one at least 3 times a week. And among supplements, there's this growing market for memory supplements or cognitive enhancers, where sales are rapidly increasing, and more than 1 in 4 Americans aged 50 and older are taking a supplement for their brain health. That's how they would classify it. And this is quite alarming, but 11% report that they're currently taking a supplement that's actually going to delay the onset of dementia, and 8% report currently taking one that is reversing dementia. And so this again is inconsistent with the evidence. So suggesting opportunities for education. So going back to our survey that we've visited now a few times, what do patients think about some of these? We found that 1 out of 4 respondents reported benefits of vitamin E, and nearly half of respondents reported benefits of fish oil. So we started this segment talking about Prevagen, and let's dig in just a little bit deeper on what's in it. So it's this protein that's isolated from a jellyfish. But when you get down to the actual evidence, the primary clinical trial that they used to claim benefit did not have a control arm, which is problematic. And then a second one failed to show improvement versus placebo. And the current thinking is that this protein is actually broken down in the gut before reaching the brain. So yeah, the evidence supporting this use is very, very weak. So I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but in that report, the Global Council provided some consensus statements. So they're recommending the best way to get your nutrients for brain health is through a healthy diet. They don't endorse any specific ingredient. This one about fatty fish, they kind of hedge a little bit and they say it may benefit cognitive function, could be due to omega-3, but it's not proven. However, they draw the distinction between getting fatty fish in your diet and taking an omega-3 supplement for which there's insufficient evidence. They point out that these distributors often make vague and exaggerated claims, so buyer beware, and also pointing out that the quality across manufacturers can vary widely, so also buyer beware. Now, as far as deprescribing supplements goes, I did a quick search preparing for this talk, and I was only able to find a couple articles, and this is the only one that I found that talked about kind of what we should be thinking about doing in this space. So it points out that we should be initiating discussions about dietary supplements with older patients. Some anchoring topics for the discussion could be focused on effectiveness or lack thereof, as some of you mentioned in your comments, interactions with other drugs, which somebody mentioned, and safety concerns. For other patients, you could maybe focus on the cost, the unnecessary cost, if that's a concern for them. But some patients will be quite wedded to these products, so it's important to strive for an open and respectful discussion. But for anyone interested in doing research in this space, it seems like there's very little that's currently published on strategies for deprescribing supplements in older adult. One strategy that comes to mind as you think about some of these is kind of low-hanging fruit. So you could think about deprescribing a supplement as an early win that then could increase your chances of deprescribing of other drugs that might be a little bit more challenging. So I think this space, as far as I'm aware, is pretty wide open for research, and hopefully folks in the network will take it on. So just to kind of wrap up, as we're coming to the end of the presentation, a lot of times you'll hear about different products, different supplements, and you wonder, what is the evidence for this? So this is a really good resource called Cognitive Vitality. And it's a group that evaluates the available evidence on strategies to promote brain health and prevent dementia. And they summarize their findings in ratings across 3 categories: evidence, potential benefit, and safety. And they summarize it, I think, in a very user-friendly and understandable manner. So you can see the strength of the evidence goes from the top, the strongest evidence from multiple RCTs, down to the very bottom would be the weakest evidence. Potential benefit, research at the very top suggests a clinically meaningful benefit, all the way down to there's no research available. And then safety, so starting from very low risk to high risk. This is a screen cap of a couple examples of drugs that they've summarized. So again, you can see a summary of each of the scores for each of the categories, and then you can click within to see the specific references that they're citing to support those. This is a comic that my colleague Edwin Tan developed earlier this year that kind of underscores the lack of effectiveness for these supplements. So the woman is saying, I've been using this wonderful supplement for brain health. It's really sharpened my mind and improved my memory. It sounds like some of the phrases that are coming straight from the Prevagen commercials. And the other woman says, what's it called? She says, I can't remember. So again, you know, there's really no evidence suggesting that these products are helping with memory. So to summarize, medication and supplement use is common and increasing. So we have our work cut out for us. For anticholinergics, the general consensus is that they increase the risk of dementia. So there's a lot of exciting and ongoing work in this space, specifically with trials to deprescribe anticholinergics. For PPIs, it's unlikely that they increase the risk of dementia, but there's plenty of other reasons to deprescribe PPIs. And so we should keep our eye on that prize. And for antihypertensives, I think there's still a lot of work to be done to see whether or not there are certain subclasses that could reduce the risk of dementia, and then getting to the point where we could actually recommend specific strategies. And for herbal supplements and vitamins, there's simply no evidence to support their use for dementia prevention in the absence of a specific indication or nutritional deficiency. So I will stop there and open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Marcum. Very helpful overview of all of these issues, and especially touching on, you know, over-the-counter and supplements. Just a reminder to put your questions into the either the Q&A or the chat, and I will read them aloud. We do have a question already, and that is, do you think that it is down to this is about antihypertensives, do you think it is down to a particular class of antihypertensives, or maybe the fact that calcium blockers can cause peripheral edema and diuretics electrolyte imbalance, which in turn can contribute to increasing frailty and progression of dementia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of the evolution of the research in this space is that it started from basically a dichotomous measure of any antihypertensive use. And then people started looking at subclasses, and people are even looking at individual drugs within subclasses. And there are actual ongoing clinical trials comparing, for example, a specific ACE inhibitor versus a specific ARB as it relates to cognitive outcomes. So the short answer is, I don't know. I mean, you could hypothesize a bunch of different mechanisms for individual drugs within a subclass and why they might differentially affect dementia risk. But I think the overall goal is to move closer and closer, when possible, toward clinically relevant comparisons so that we can actually use these results.
Great. Okay, next question from the participants. What are the potential data sources to study the effects of dietary supplements on brain health?
That is a great question. So yes, you're indirectly highlighting one of the major barriers, which is we do a very bad job at collecting medication data in general, but especially herbal supplements and OTC products. So I would say, you know, the best current sources are longitudinal cohort studies who have done a good job of this. So for example, the source from the Cato article, it's a nationally representative data set. Survey data could be used as well. I don't know if we do a great job of documenting this in the EHR, so that might not be the best approach. But I would say the current best data sources for these variables would be existing longitudinal cohort studies. And just one last point, of course, the challenge is these don't appear in claims data, so you're not going to find them there.
Right. Okay, a question from a panelist, Mike Steinman. So could you comment on the extent to which safety data is known from Prevagen or other commonly used supplements? So we don't have evidence that they work, but how strongly should we be pushing for discontinuation for patients who want to keep taking them?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. I have not seen any safety data coming out around Prevagen. What I did see recently in neurology clinical practice was a group who looked at the presence of basically things that shouldn't be in some of these products. I don't think Prevagen was one of their examples, but they were looking at products from around the world that are kind of like this, cognitive enhancers. And they basically found that due to the lack of regulation, that they were basically dirty, right? There were other things in there that shouldn't have been. So there's evidence to show that the manufacturing leads to things that we don't want in these products, but I haven't seen any sort of like FDA adverse event data linking with specifically Prevagen, but that actually would be a great research question if people are interested.
Great. While we wait for other questions, can you comment on the attitudes and beliefs of providers who are not attending this call or this presentation, and how much of the problem is a lack of expertise and knowledge from people who are prescribing, especially with regard to supplements?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think, the first issue that I see is that we're probably not doing a good job of even asking about these. So we don't even know what people are using. So it gets at the medication reconciliation issue. So to me, that would be the important first step, is to just start the conversation to ask people, what are they using, to then document it. And I totally understand in a short 15-minute visit, whether or not to stop their vitamin E is, less important than the most pressing issue that brought them there. So, but I do think, there are other people on the team and other ways that we could kind of clean up the medication list. So I don't want to speak for providers' opinions about this, but I just think it's more of a system issue of kind of lack of time and kind of who's going to own this part of the medication list.
Right. And a comment just came in from Lara Seitz, who wrote that in Austria, supplements are often containing higher amounts than recommended. So the potential safety issue there. And then there was another earlier comment about a PBS show, maybe you alluded to this, on supplements that will convince you to never take another supplement. So other discussion, questions from the panelists?
I haven't seen that PBS show, but I'll have to look it up.
And we do see this sort of paradoxical, this patient, the patient who is so willing to, spend money and take supplements, but will never take a medication that you prescribe. In some ways that there's some sense to that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there's, comparing prescription drugs with some of these supplements, and if you want to start thinking about deprescribing, I think we'll definitely need to be strongly considering patient beliefs and attitudes toward these different categories of drugs, and then come up with strategies for how we could communicate, to meet the patient in the middle. Because, if you just tell them to stop taking this vitamin that they've been taking for 20 years and they strongly believe has actually got them to where they are today, it's just not going to work.
Right. And that's echoed in some of the comments that we're seeing. It's often difficult to start the supplement deprescribing conversation because we would be challenging patients' beliefs.
Yeah.
And then a comment from Colleen Hicks that in Canada, the government is often recalling foreign herbal supplements that are found to contain Viagra derivatives and steroids. I don't know if you have any reaction to that. And then finally, I find it interesting that patients sometimes see prescription meds as being pushed by big pharma, but not the supplements and minerals.
That's a great point. Yeah, kind of the patient perception. Big pharma is painted out to be this big bad monster, whereas the commercials on TV, presented next to a toothpaste commercial, are thought to be a little bit softer and more agreeable. I'll just say that comment about the products being tainted. The article I mentioned in Neurology Clinical Practice, some of the messy components that were in there were actually anti-seizure drugs in some of those products. So these are not benign other ingredients that end up in them. So yeah, it's pretty alarming. I don't think most people realize how the FDA does or does not regulate supplements in the US, and I'm sure in other countries as well, they're equivalent. So.
Good. Well, we can hold open the Q&A for another minute or so. Any last thoughts, Dr. Marcum?
I would just encourage people again to think about how they might be able to contribute to the research in this space, because I think it's quite different than deprescribing prescription drugs. The whole process, the whole regulatory process, how patients come to these products, what they think about them. So I just think it's kind of low-hanging fruit, but also really important to kind of maximize medication regimens for older adults.
Great, thank you very much. Jen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Zach. I really thought it was interesting, and I really appreciate the invitation to all the attendees to think about jumping in, because there's so much work left to be done. So that was really wonderful. So thank you for joining us and for all the work you're doing. And I want to thank everybody for joining us on the call today and for all of your questions. And I'm definitely going to watch that show on PBS, because I want to see what's in there, so my mom will finally listen to me and stop taking stuff. So thank you all for attending today. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the US Deprescribing Research Network website. And please fill out the short evaluation that will follow right after this webinar. Our next webinar is going to be with Lisa Harrington from Kaiser, Northern California, who will be talking about a deprescribing trial. And check in with the website or watch your emails for the date and time for that. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.